un invitado muy especial. Es para nosotros un placer y un profundo honor tener al profesor Jesse Jupiter, a quien conocemos de su amplia trayectoria, y esta noche muy amablemente ha querido compartir con nosotros algunas de sus experiencias. Desde ahora le damos las gracias. Paso al doctor Jaime Quintero, quien va a hacer la presentación del profesor. Nuevamente gracias a ustedes, gracias al profesor Jupiter, y espero que esta presentación y este intercambio de ideas sea muy provechoso para los objetivos de nuestro programa. Nuevamente, bienvenidos todos. Professor Jupiter, thank you again. It's a pleasure for us to be
My pleasure.
share your experience with us. Thank you very much.
Bueno, buenas noches a todos. Buenos días por aquí al otro lado del charco. Y bien, muchas gracias, doctor Lizcano. Y realmente hoy es un día muy especial para todos, para los miembros y residentes del departamento y para los colegas, las colegas, los amigos, las amigas que se han conectado desde varios puntos de Colombia y Latinoamérica. Y celebramos a un gran amigo, a un amigo de la casa. Celebramos su ciencia y su conocimiento. Celebramos su generosidad inmensa y sus virtudes de ser humano especial. Si me pusiera a leer todo el currículum y hacer la presentación, tomaría mucho tiempo, así que voy a ser muy puntual en algunos aspectos que resaltar en nuestro ilustre invitado. Jesse es el profesor de la cátedra Hans-Jörg Wyss de cirugía ortopédica de la Escuela de Medicina de la Universidad de Harvard y es el director emérito del Servicio de Mano y Extremidad Superior del Massachusetts General Hospital. Él comenzó su carrera brillante con una magna cum laude, que es un título el más alto que se le da a un estudiante en ciencias clásicas, y recibió posteriormente su título de médico en la Universidad de Yale en 1972. Luego de un año de internado, sirvió posteriormente, y este es un aspecto interesante, porque sirvió como médico general en el servicio de salud de la comunidad de los indios Pima en Arizona. Y él ha contado muchas veces su experiencia en estas comunidades de Arizona. Bien, en 1975 ingresa al programa de residencia de ortopedia y traumatología en la Universidad de Harvard, y en el año 80 viajó a Basilea para una beca AO. Posteriormente completó su fellow de cirugía de mano y microcirugía en Louisville, Kentucky. 1981 es un punto de inflexión, un año y punto de inflexión al iniciar su carrera docente, que cumple más de 40 años en la Universidad de Harvard y en el Massachusetts General Hospital. Ha sido instructor, profesor, guía, mentor e inspirador de más de 400 residentes, más de 80 fellows en cirugía de mano, todos ellos y ellas líderes en Estados Unidos y en el resto del mundo. Ha participado en congresos, cursos, talleres en más de 50 países, visitó todos los países de Latinoamérica, miembro honorario de 25 sociedades científicas y miembro del comité editorial de 15 revistas nacionales e internacionales, y distinciones muchas, porque aquí hay una lista muy larga. Pero yo voy a resumir diciendo que él es un pensador ilustrado, ecuménico, tolerante y curioso. Y es como trotador global que ha dictado más de 1000 conferencias, ha tenido 165 invitaciones de profesor visitante, 400 publicaciones, 182 revisiones y 160 capítulos en libros, y coautor de 12 libros. Pero lo más importante, está casado hace 47 años con Beryl Stephanie y disfruta de su hija Stacy, su nieto Cooper. Yo creo que Latinoamérica y Colombia tal vez tengamos una deuda muy grande, tal vez saldada en gran parte por los resultados obtenidos en nuestros pacientes que han sido tratados bajo la inspiración de su mano pródiga en compasión y su saber y actuar prodigiosos en conocimientos y virtudes. Así que, Jesse,
Okay.
tú eres de la casa. Tú eres familia, eres nuestro amigo, de todos los que te escuchan. Tú eres del vecindario, así que venga y cuéntanos historias. Tell us stories for us. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Well, I appreciate very much having this opportunity. I'm sorry I can't deliver it in your native language, but we'll try our best. And it's a tribute to my longstanding friendship with not only Jaime, but with so many people in your country. And I watch with great pleasure to see how people have added to our fund of knowledge, as well as been excellent teachers in the AO particularly. Well, I look at some things about innovation and the innovators and get a sense of what it's all about, but also look at what are the obstacles to success. What were the obstacles that these men and women have taken to cover and overcome them? Men like this, notice the arrow in your lower left corner, have developed so many positive things and contributed to our understanding of our knowledge. And as you know, the old expression, new is hot and old is not, is quite prevalent now in many fields as we try to take advantage of technology and improve our lives and our knowledge. Our journals feature so many articles about new techniques and new devices, and it becomes very difficult to know to what extent there's peer review and is the peer review sufficient. And I'm going to go back and forth about the virus and the pandemic, because a lot of the things that occurred with this in the scientific world will be appropriate in dealing with this discussion about what science is and how accurate we are in our scientific evaluations. Our institutions focus on innovation. Every area you see programs looking at innovation in this and innovation in that, and leadership and technology, etc. So what I'd like to look at a little bit about innovations, how this concept applies to our specialty. What are some of the common threads found in these successful innovators? And what might be obstacles for future innovation and innovators? We'll look at the obstacles, considering particularly in some detail existing problems with our scientific studies. We'll bring into focus the fact of the medical industrial complex on healthcare. And we should all evaluate perspectives on our own relationships with industry and research. You know, for a number of years, innovation was really a word and concept that was much more applicable in the business world. And innovation in development and technology went way back to the light bulb and other things like that. But we have this now in our world. For example, in the concept of enabling technology, that is a technology that enabled us to do things we never could do before. Take the operating microscope. With that and the evolution of finer tools and finer threads, we've been able to do remarkable things, not just in replantation, but in tissue transfer and brachial plexus work, in nerve transfer and other areas throughout the body. Another one is the locking screw, initially developed by the AO development group at the about 1979, 1980 for use in the maxillofacial world, But look what it did and what it enabled us to be able to do throughout the musculoskeletal system. And the earliest locking plate in orthopedics was this distal radius plate that the AO brought out. And Heiner Winker in Germany, in Erfurt, picked this up very early on and realized that you can treat many dorsally displaced Colles fractures, even in osteopenic patients, with a volar plate. And he had extraordinary results. He's not well quoted because his writing was in German and he didn't speak throughout the world. But in fact, he was sent very important into this understanding this concept. Subsequently, George Orbe took this and developed evolution of this and what might be called a sustaining technology. That is, it is able to be transmitted throughout the world, used on patients throughout the world, and maintained its ability to do its job, so to speak. And Orbe not only improved the design, but developed surgical approaches as well. And if we look now and these plates, we notice that there are all sorts of evolutions about this, but it goes back to that, really that seminal development of the locking screw. There's also a technological term called disruptive technology. And in our specialty, we'll see this with stable internal fixation with combined injuries in the hand and wrist. And these two Swiss gentlemen, Buchler on the bottom and Fernandez on top, brought this not only to our attention, but to the world of hand surgery, to the world of reconstructive and trauma development, and improve the outcomes substantially. And like in everything, it takes a while, and that's why it's disruptive, because when this first came out, particularly in North America, there was tremendous backlash about it, and people felt that it's not the right thing to do, but it's withstood the test of time. And where it's also been spectacular is in the maxillofacial world. And Paul Manson at Johns Hopkins in the United States really put this into the forefront and developed locking plates and screws for the maxilla, for the mandible, for the orbit, and anywhere that there was a pan face fracture could be stabilized. And finally, Paul Gramont in France developed the reverse shoulder. And this changed also in a disruptive way to change the treatment of very difficult fractures in people who had osteopenic bone or rotator cuff difficulties as well. The second thing we'll look at is concepts as they apply to our specialty. And we'll look at some of these in just brief observation. The first is a novel surgical procedure. Hill Hastings in the US developed a concept of taking a little piece of the hamate bone and using it to replace injured articular surfaces in the finger joint. And while this doesn't seem like an earth-shattering situation, it was unique, it was innovative, and it solved a problem that prior did not have a good solution. Another thing is significant modification. James May is a plastic surgeon at my institution and was faced with this unusual but tragic situation of a young man who had a blast injury to both hands. In the right hand that lost his thumb, he had a complete brachial plexus palsy with a Horner sign, and he had no sensation and no use of that hand. On the opposite hand, he had lost his fingers, but he had a good thumb, at least a sensate and somewhat mobile thumb. And with that concept and innovative thinking, and I'll bring this to mind later. These individuals there's something about it that they can see more clearly what the problem is and what might be a resolution. And he then took this useless 4-digit hand, transferred it over, and gave the individual at least a sensate, partially mobile hand that restored his independence of function. Now, another innovation in our specialty is the use of endoscopy. We've seen endoscopy go from simple arthroscopy of joints to endoscopy of treating compressed nerves, brachial plexus injuries, and of course, the use of arthroscopy and endoscopy in treating ligament injuries and meniscal injuries has changed the sports world for sure. Another way is starting to use combinations of established techniques, perhaps for the first time. This was a young woman I saw who had some childhood problem and developed probably an osteomyelitis and loss of most of her radius, and presented as an adult with this problem. By taking an Ilizarov and bringing out the soft tissues and realigning the axis of this forearm, we then used a technique that was described by Hardy Weber, a wave plate, and bridged the defect in the radius and gave her a stable hand and a functional forearm using these combined techniques. And lastly, a novel application for established implant or technology. One of my colleagues was faced with this very large woman who had a grossly unstable elbow dislocation that would not stay in joint with any immobilization externally. And he decided, why not treat it with a bridge plate, at least temporary. And he kept this on for 3 months, and look at the result. So a very creative person thinking about how to deal with this problem. However, when we're faced with new technology and new innovation and new surgical techniques or implants, we may also face some difficulties. Scott was a urologist, and in the early 21st century, excuse me, he produced this small paper about the rise and fall of new surgical techniques. And he called it the Scott's Parabola. And what he suggested was there's a promising idea, perhaps a research tool that starts out, but then it seems to be very encouraging, and it's presented at national meetings, and then industry picks it up, and strong media pressure perhaps, and there's a general introduction to the public, and becomes, in fact, for many, a standard treatment. However, as time progresses, sometimes a long time, sometimes not so long, some doubts creep in, and some scientific studies then suggest, well, wait a minute, there may be some problems. And then in this country, medical legal things develop. And then all of a sudden, these same authorities who were promoting it condemn it, and it ends up taken off the shelf. And sometimes our operating room people want to know why we still have this expensive, obsolete equipment. And Scott said, well, it's for ancient surgeons to amaze their juniors with rollicking stories of the old days. It's not really a parabola. This is a parabola, but it's useful to use that concept as well. And we've seen this all through orthopedic technology and developments. Chymopepandise was a very popular technique for putting in slip discs and dissolving them, but unfortunately the complications were substantial, including paraplegia and stroke. And more recently, this medicine infused that was used to promote bone healing, especially in the spine, and it ended up having to be taken off the market as well. Again, in both of these, there were huge financial issues that were involved. And I told you about the AO first locking plate that this group of us developed. And we thought it really fit the needs. It was pre-contoured, but a flexible design. It had buttress pins or screws that would lock into the plate. And we hoped that the screw heads would be recessed and they would be self-tapping screws. And this is what happened, exactly what Scott predicted. And while it was very enthusiastically taken up by many, many surgeons worldwide, we had a prospective study looking at this, and the results were very encouraging. But what happened was people started to see problems, and the problems were starting to be somewhat substantial. Tendon irritation or plate breakage were occurring. And the question was it related to the design or was it related to the metallurgy? Well, the design was flawed. It didn't have the ability to really recess the screws. And if the screw was not buried into the locked hole and had an edge showing, that might be a cause for tendon irritation. Secondly, it was encouraged to bend the plate and break and cut the plate so it could fit with different size wrists. But bending a plate changes the metallurgy tremendously and the smoothness of this. And these were not machine polished plates. And what happened was either bending it or cutting it created a very irregular surface. And then titanium, if you have an irritated tendon, it tends to stick to titanium. And so all of those were problems. And this is what happened as a result. And certainly we could not find this if we looked for it in North America. And that takes me to what might be these common threads. Many people thought the gifted individual was really the reason why somebody could come up with something that was unique. And for centuries, people thought on the whole, the gods do not bestow more than one gift on a person. John Stuart Mill, who was a philosopher and an academician in England, he pointed out that common tendency among mankind is to consider all power which is not visibly the effect of practice, all skill which is not capable of being reduced to mechanical rules, as the particular result of a particular gift. And there again goes back to the suggestion that it's maybe a lot more than just a, in quote, gift. And this was best said by Thomas Edison, who, among other things, invented the incandescent light bulb. And he said, genius is 1 part inspiration and 99% perspiration. Steve Jobs similarly identified the fact you need passion or this search for truth in order to achieve success, but you need perseverance when it gets tough. And that takes me to this concept of 10,000 hours. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a very popular book called Outliers, where he looked at a variety of different successful people or successful entrepreneurs or industrial developments. And he took the concept that was started by the social scientist K. Anders Ericsson. Ericsson studied the Music Conservatorium in Berlin, a very selective school and a very high level of competence in the students. And then he looked over time to see what happened after they graduated. And then he saw which ones were in the Berlin Symphony and others in teaching music school and others not even pursuing a professional career. And what he came up was that those who practiced the most, seemingly, had a better chance of others than doing well. And he came up with this idea, this arbitrary idea of 10,000 hours. But what he was describing is this deliberate practice. Gladwell, as an example, used the Beatles. The Beatles were not a very popular group whatsoever when they started out. And they went over and got a job in a kind of a sleazy bar in Hamburg, Germany. They lived in a rooming house, didn't speak the language. And what they did is just practice all day, every day. And what they came up with is this unique style, this unique way of approaching music. And of course, the rest is history. But this idea of practice, 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 this so-called 10,000 hours, may seem somewhat arbitrary, but it is at the base of many innovations that have occurred. William Dugan is also an academician, and he looked at what he called strategic intuition, and goes back to a German general named Karl von Clausewitz, who identified 4 seminal components that might make some people become innovators or achieve a success in what might not have been seemingly possible. He used Napoleon as one example, and Napoleon demonstrated von Clausewitz's 4 steps of strategic intuition. Intelligent memory. He had read many books and treatises about the military conflicts and strategies. He had the presence of mind, and in particular, when he was trying to convince his senior officers about storming the naval base at Toulouse in the southern part of France, that people thought was not able to be done. And then he had this flash of insight, or coup d'oeil, that somehow he could see through the fog, so to speak, and come up with the idea. And then his resolution was that he put forth a very vehement and vigorous argument to convince his leaders that this is the right thing to do. And guess what? Against all current thinking, it was the right thing to do. Another example is an American general in the American Revolutionary War who brought a bunch of cannons a long distance to put on a hill that was not a strategic hill overlooking Boston, and that's what people thought. But because with these cannons, he could drop cannonballs into the British Navy in the harbor, he changed the entire picture of the battle in Boston, and which started the American Revolution as well. And Joan of Arc in the 14th century went against all odds and convinced her army that it was wise to go in and overtake the bad guys who took over their cannons and their castles. Again, doing something that nobody thought at the time was reasonable, and she had the resolution to do that. Is that applicable to all these people? I believe so. in one way or another, they each in their own way had something about them that were able to look at problems, look at their past experiences, look at perhaps a brilliant idea, and had the resolution to pursue it very well. And I want to highlight this a little further in 4 surgeons. Remember, I'm talking about intelligent memory, the presence of mind to know what has been done before, to know what the problems that need to be surmounted. Maybe they get a flash of insight. They can look at the surgical field and say, wait a minute, there's a better way. But they pursue it. They resolve it by working perhaps that 10,000 hours. Jaime told me you had in the recent times, a webinar about Hardy Weber, and without question, he has developed tremendous techniques and concepts. This is a guy who had a non-union of his humerus. He was operated on 5 times. He had a failed IM nail, failed plate, failed rod again, and this concept that Hardy Weber introduced about the wave plate is rather brilliant. It doesn't require any special plate. Any plate could be used. And by bending it off the bone, just proximal and just distal to where the non-union is, you're doing a few things. You're increasing the ability for the vascularity to enter into the bone graft. You're reducing the potential of fatigue of the plate because you're distributing bending forces. You know, when we put a plate on and it fails, it always fails where there's a bending force that's stronger than the plate over time. And by doing this, you're distributing it like you would see in some types of bridges that go over highways or rivers. And what it does in a way is by putting this bone graft under it, you're reconstructing in a way the opposite cortex, and that allows the plate to function as a tension band. And so this patient had this treated. There's the cancellous graft under the plate. Here's the article that we talked about with Jaime contributing. And this is what it looks like. The bone, purely cancellous bone, develops a response to load, and it corticalizes, and the patient has a very stable, functional elbow and shoulder. Hardy Weber, as you know, was instrumental in developing the concept of non-unions and types of non-unions, and how they respond to different treatments. Another fellow is Alberto Fernandez in Montevideo, Uruguay. And he looked at several problems and came up with some very ingenious ways of approaching this. One is the helical implant, where he took a plate for minimally invasive passage and bent it to contour with the ability to go in the frontal plane proximally and in the sagittal plane distally, without having to expose a great deal of muscle or any other soft tissue. And it proved to be very effective in combination with other plates, and even when you had non-unions and delayed unions. And so it's a unique idea and very innovative, and MIPO is certainly a well-established concept, and this was published in a scientific supplement about an injury. He also expanded the AO external fixation devices, which were very limited, by introducing a variety of different clamps, and enabled long bones as well as metaphyseal segments to be bridged in a very creative way, as illustrated here in these cases as well. He then also took a whole amount of clinical cases of his and others, documented from pre-op X-ray, pre-op CT, intraoperative imaging, intraoperative X-rays, intraoperative, postoperative imaging, as well as CT and follow-up, and created a database. It's called the ICUC. That's IC, and you can see if you go into this database. And he has hundreds and hundreds of cases in every area of the musculoskeletal system. And the important point is they're all well documented with outcome as well. And we've been making some videos with it and webinars and ViewMedi series, and we've had several publications based upon this. The other individual is Kurt Karl Stem. You may not know of him. I certainly didn't until I learned about him. He was in Kiel, Germany at the turn of the late 1900s. And he was a urologist and interested in OBGYN. And he developed the concept of laparoscopy. And he made his own instruments. He made his own documentation, every case documented. And when he first presented it to the German Surgical Society, he was not only called a liar, but there was a large movement to have his surgical privileges removed. His colleagues at Kiel University made him take a brain scan because they thought there's something upstairs that was a problem. And his initial articles documenting hundreds of cases were rejected and even suggested that he was doing malpractice. Well, nowadays we know that laparoscopy and has expanded the armamentarium of many, many surgeons and benefited hundreds of thousands of patients. And there's a Kurt Stem medal given out every year in the International Society of Laparoscopy, attributing to him. And the last patient is, individual surgeon is someone I already mentioned, Paul Manson. And when Paul finished his plastic surgery residency at Johns Hopkins, this is how these pan-face cases were treated. And he said, it's not acceptable. And he started to look at, because this is the way they often turned out, he started to look at how can we put the pieces together? How can we get to the access of these difficult areas? How can we stabilize these? And he started to develop plate and screw systems and aesthetic incisions to get to these, and understanding the way that we have done in other bones to reconstruct the skeletal buttress system, at times using a free tissue transfer to help in the exposure. This was a 16-year-old young woman who had multiple fractures in her face from an auto accident. Here, these are all small plates, mandibular plates, maxillar plates, or suborbital plates. And this was her result. And when Paul Manson started to do this, he was brought before the surgical chief at the institution he was working at, and they wanted to take away his privileges. But he persisted, and of course, innovation has become well accepted. So let's look at some of the existing problems with our studies, talk about medical industrial issues, and think about our evaluation of ourselves with industry and research. You know, the musculoskeletal research system actually rewards positive results. there's really little motivation to perform negative studies or those that duplicate prior publication. And there have been several studies that have looked at positive trials, that is, trials that have ended up with positive results, and those that ended up with negative results. And interestingly, find the same amount of time to conduct it, but negative trials take 2 to 4 years longer to be published. And that's really the truth. I've experienced that as well. Freddie Fu is chief of orthopedics in Pittsburgh. And he talks about the evidence-based triad that's combining best available evidence with clinical expertise of the physician and the expectation and value of the patient. Contrast that with the orthopedic triad: famous surgeon, famous athlete, untested treatment. Now, if you want to see the examples of that, just look at these ads for total hips and showing that exact situation. Another orthopedic surgeon in California talked about that the reproducible of published work is only occasionally challenged by knowledgeable scientists and clinicians who work in the same field, or by industry when it tries to duplicate results before proceeding with product development. In contrast, successful venture capitalists would be more inclined to reproduce results by independent observers before committing to early funding. John Ioannidis is a guru in this field. He is a gentleman born in Greece and was a mathematic prodigy. And he came over in Boston and graduated from Harvard Med School and realized that you can apply mathematical analyses to these scientific studies. And he came up with this idea that, or this statement that in many different ways, much of what biomedical researchers conclude is misleading, exaggerated, and at times wrong. Now put that in the picture of all that you heard, saw on TV and read about everybody's talking about the virus and all the different statements and what people took as truth. His first landmark paper in this online journal looked at a number of studies in different fields of medical research, and he found 80% of non-randomized studies turn out to be in error. 25% of randomized controlled trials were also flawed, and 10% of what's called platinum, that is large academic centers, high funding, 10% of these have major flaws. He talked about that in randomized controlled trials, he found it was easy to manipulate results at every step. There's room to distort results, room to make a stronger claim, or select what is going to be concluded. He called this intellectual conflict of interest. He said that a lot of things can skew the studies. What questions research asked, how they set up the study, which patients were included, which measurements were used, how data was analyzed, how results presented, and how studies came to be published. And if you recall about the virus, Lancet came out with very strong statements about the origin of the virus. And it turned out that some of the reviewers and some of the authors were scientists who had actually economic interest in the Chinese lab. Yet Lancet has had to retract that over time. He then made another important study, and he looked at 49 of the most highly regarded research findings in medicine over a 13-year period, 45 of which had claimed to uncover effective interventions. Remember, aspirin would help prevent heart disease, which has now turned out to be not the case. 34 had been retested with 41% showing to be wrong or substantially exaggerated results. He said that much of the wrongness problem could be solved if the world simply stopped expecting scientists to be right. But as long as careers remain contingent on producing a stream of research that is dressed up to seem more right than it is, scientists will keep delivering exactly that. He said, science is a noble endeavor, but it is also a low-yield endeavor. I'm not sure that more than a very small percentage of medical research is ever likely to lead to major improvements in clinical outcomes and quality of life. We should all be very comfortable with that fact. And if you remember what people talked about, whether wearing a mask was good or wearing not good, and the statements were made with very strong statements with sincerity, but obviously things evolved and it changes. Finally, what are the obstacles? Well, one is ethics and regulation. And remember all of this. And we hope that we can avoid getting into this conundrum of problems. If we look way back at the Belmont report, that's about scientific research. And in fact, talked about radically new procedures should prompt formal evaluation as early as possible. And that's not always the case. An article in New York Times in talking about metal on metal hips and how these were deemed to be the latest, greatest, and didn't turn out to be that way. Arthroscopic surgeons became very enthusiastic about thermal capsular shift. It hastened the procedure much faster and thought to be much better until they started seeing this in young athletes where total head necrosis of the humeral head after a thermal capsulorrhaphy. This orthopedic surgeon in Mayo Clinic mentioned a very interesting statement. He said, it's easy to argue that as society, we need rules in the knife fight of medicine to protect our patients and ultimately our profession. Our patients cannot and should not be made to bear the judging between medical treatment options with regard to their efficacy and safety. Well, for those of you who are residents, there are some obstacles. How much time do you have to learn operative surgery? Residents now have hour restrictions. They have opportunities that are restricted by medical legal issues, and things may not be as easy. Reimbursement is a problem. When one starts to go out and practice, how are we reimbursed may influence how much we can do and how we can develop our techniques. And life really stresses are more and more recognized, and the role of your profession and your family and your occupation all are now in conflict. So John Herrickson, surgeon to Queen Victoria, said, although methods of practice may be modified and varied and even improved to some extent, the knife cannot always have fresh fields for conquest. And I say this because more and more we're going to see a surgeon having to be competent in biomedical issues, in biologic issues, in the use of genetic manipulation, and a whole variety of non-hands-on surgical approaches in the management of many of our problems, patients' problems. Peter Drucker was a guru in innovation, and he said, in innovation, as in any other work, there is talent, there is ingenuity, there is predisposition. But when all is said and done, innovation becomes hard focused, purposeful work, making very great demands on diligence, on persistence, and on commitment. If these are lacking, no amount of talent, ingenuity, or knowledge will avail. Thank you very much.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Jesse. Muchas gracias, Jesse, for this wonderful journey, por este viaje maravilloso. Wonderful journey through the history of human efforts to make life simpler, but it seems that innovation is not always going in the right direction. Como él ha dicho, este viaje de la búsqueda de innovación, pues no siempre llega a puerto feliz. What about questions? Tenemos algunas preguntas aquí.
Hola, doctor Quintero. Pues para los participantes que quieran hacer algunas preguntas, creo que ya hay alguna en el chat. Y yo quiero hacer una pregunta. I have a question that is based on my personal observation and perception. And I have to confess that I am an early adopter. When it's a new phone, I like to sniff around and I get anxiety if I have to buy it and so on. Over time, I have realized that most of the time, the phone doesn't solve any problem for me. So obviously, when it comes to phones, you probably won't do any harm. But the risk with orthopedic devices maybe is do harm when something goes wrong. How to reconcile the advance of science and technology and the improvement of techniques and avoid doing harm? What to do with me and people like me that are early adopters, and when a new device is out, we want to use immediately, even when it's not evidence to show that it's a better choice comparing with other devices?
Well, there's several levels that you have addressed, but there are variations of a device. So you take a locking plate for the distal radius, and now we have another shape of the plate, but it's the same concept, it's the same metallurgy, the same structure. So that certainly could be looked at by surgeons' preference or teaching about it, but it's not really a major innovation. But if you take and say, I don't think we need the locking plate, but we can inject this new type of glue into the fracture. Well, that's a variation from the standard technique and standard of care. So I think institutions need to be proactive in anything that's like that, that's equivalent of a new concept, a new technology, or a new way to solve a problem that is seemingly radical. There should be a way either within your department or your institution, committee or whatever, to review that, and the outcome of the cases have to be very carefully documented. And that's what we didn't do so well in the past, you see. So it's really a recognition of to do what's right for your patients and yourself. I think you bring up a good point, and you know, industry is very sensitive to this to a certain degree, but sometimes they push the envelopes, I say, so to speak, and people get very excited about it. I remember many years ago, there'd be an AO course, and there would be one morning on pelvic fractures. And there would be the bone models and showing the plates and screws fixation areas, and listening to some practicing surgeons saying, "God, I can't wait to get home and use these." Well, that's not the right way to do things, you know? And that's what happened too often to all of us. And so I think we have to have a self responsibility. One more thing, I think it's very important that we all recognize that what Ionita said, science is not always, scientists and science, not always right. It takes duplication. It takes other people reviewing or trying to do things. But the way things are now, either it comes out in the newspapers or TV early on, it sets the stock market when you have a new technology, or it becomes people who use that avenue to promote themselves. Somebody asked, Gustavo asked in the chat, sharing a new idea, gaining peer support, you know, so that's something that social media, you talked about your cell phone, but your cell phone is one of the culprits of pushing for social media and all of these information that may or may not be correct.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Oscar. Bueno, creo que a Gustavo ya le contestaron. Gustavo, we have another question here. Sometimes you have techniques or products that fell in obsolescence, and some of these techniques may return from the death valley or zone.
Yeah.
What do you think is key to bring an obsolete, maybe technique or whatever, to life when it deserves it?
Oh, I think there is never something that becomes so obsolete if it's an idea. If it's an implant or some other thing, it may be a lot different. But let me use again distal radius. In many hospitals in the United States, they may have trouble finding the external fixator for distal radius fracture. Everybody's using that volar plate or K-wires. Many people have lost the way to use K-wires, okay? Or even reduce a fracture and mold a cast, okay? Are these obsolete? I don't think so. I don't think so, but what it would take is a large study looking at outcome and cost. And you may find that the outcome for, you know, collies, unstable collies, not complex, with the K-wires and a cast might be just as good as with a volar plate, and yet quite a bit less expensive. You see? So that's it. For some people, I would ask our resident, have you ever used the K-wire for this? No, I've never seen, never. Okay. You know, we had a study with a colleague at one of our other hospitals, and for Dupuytren's contracture, they inject this collagenase that dissolves the Dupuytren's and doesn't require surgery. I've always done surgery. I think the injection I always thought it was not so great, but it's new technology, it's innovative, and patients, all the things that they were saying, patients, you know, wanted, they asked for it. They, you know, so we did a study where they looked at about 50 of my patients, single finger, who just had surgery, and a little bit more of their patients who had the injection. And you know, their patients had 6 times more problems, 6 times more complications. Okay, that will be published soon because it's very controversial. Because here now industry, I was telling someone that industry, oh, are they going to have, you know, some troubles with it? And he told me, don't worry about industry, because you know where they're using the Botox now? For dissolving fat in like people's arms where the fat hangs down. Instead of liposuction, they inject the Botox or the collagenase. So that's a bigger market. So don't worry about the industry. They call it cellulite. Cellulite.
Ok, ¿alguna otra pregunta aquí? A ver, Oscar, ¿tienes algo en YouTube de preguntas?
No, creo que ya en YouTube no hay preguntas y del chat creo que no sé si alguien más quiere hacer alguna pregunta.
Bueno, muy bien. Thank you, Jesse, again. It has been really a pleasure visiting with you and listening to this fantastic journey into the let's say the odyssey of innovation. And you address this very hot topic that innovation is not always as it should be. Sometimes things go wrong, as you showed us in the Scott's parabola. So people should have a look and be cautious sometimes on new developments and avoid this hype thing, you know. The hype thing. We could not find with Camilo, who is here, who gave a nice lecture on the hype innovations, a term in Spanish for hype.
Hype, yeah.
I don't know, but
we have the same term.
Gracias a todos por conectarse, gracias por estar presente. El próximo mes de agosto, que es el 10, que es el segundo martes, tenemos nuestro siguiente webinar. Y aquí tenemos un tema muy interesante también, que es la diversidad e inclusión. Y este tema lo vamos a tocar con 3 distinguidas colegas, una cirujana veterinaria de Stanford, una cirujana ortopedista de Sao Paulo y una cirujana maxilofacial de Medellín, que nos van a hablar también del liderazgo femenino en el área médica y de sus experiencias. Así que, pues bueno, muchas gracias, los vemos. Thanks, Jesse.
Bye.
Stay safe and healthy y gracias a todos. Bueno,
stay well.
Gracias a los colegas también.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos. Feliz noche.
Feliz noche.